Howdy, folks. Today we're going to talk about evidence and how to use evidence to support our claims that we're creating in writing. Also, by exploring evidence, we get to see kind of how and why authors are introducing quotations or references in the way that they do. So when we're talking about evidence, specifically, we're going to talk about academic analysis for today. And here's kind of an example where I say, according to researchers, quote, I give the quote, and then I add that little citation at the end. So people know where my information came from. That's the type of evidence we're talking about today. And so it kind of has this spectrum of most specific to least specific. So obviously a quotation is word for word, here's what someone else said, and I'm using that in my argument without changing a thing. And remember, with quotes, I can start and stop them wherever I want. I don't always have to use a full sentence, but it has to be those exact words. I don't get to change anything. Taking a step down, I get to paraphrase. So maybe I'm taking a quote, but it's not quite fitting in with my writing, or I just need to maybe simplify the language because maybe this is from a really high level academic, but I'm writing for my high school teacher who's an idiot. So we might need to paraphrase that. So take their words, basically keep the idea obviously the same, but we're going to adapt their writing and change their word for word structure of that sentence, but keep the things the same. Another step down would be I'm just going to summarize their ideas, not even just taking a sentence and paraphrasing it. I'm maybe taking an idea and distilling it down. And then lastly, there's this idea of just referencing something. So I might reference Shakespeare in one of my papers, but I'm not specifically quoting him, paraphrasing him, or even summarizing any of his plays. I'm just referencing maybe an idea that he presented. So these are the types of evidences we're looking at today. There are other types of evidences that I want you guys to be mindful of, right? Because we don't always have the opportunity to go out and find quotations and paraphrase them. Sometimes when we're writing, we need to think off the top of our head and be able to pull out like real world examples or other parts of evidence. References to pop culture, like songs, music, movies, all of those, literature, work as evidence too. Hypothetical evidence, you can imagine a world when this happens, or even just personal experience. So a lot of these types of evidences down here are things you're going to use in free writes or timed writes, like on the ACT or things where like, I don't have time to research, but I can defend this in the same way that we're going to look at some of this more direct evidence, this academic evidence. All right. So when we are introducing evidence, a couple things to note is I always try to include a signal word, right? Because you're writing as yourself, your paper or your argument or whatever it is. And then when you pull in evidence, it needs to be clear to the reader that you are using someone else's thoughts now. We're going to introduce someone else. So I always kind of try to vary up the verbs that I'm using when I use what's called a signal word or a signal phrase. So I'm typing along and all of a sudden I want to pull in some evidence from Mr. Restad. And so I might do a sentence that says the writer, the teacher, Mr. Restad, signifying, okay, someone else is being brought in, player two has entered the game. And then pick a verb that's going to kind of fit. Maybe he argues that black coffee is the true drink of a refined human being. Maybe he emphasizes or contends or observes that black coffee is the true drink of a refined human being. These words, these verbs, help readers know, okay, this is one person's idea, not the author's idea, but this is another person's idea. So we get that separation and that delineation between yourself and the evidence that you're bringing in, right? You get to kind of objectively say, here are other people's opinions, and then I'm going to use them in my works to analyze them. So we found a phrase, we found something, we've used a signal phrase, we're quoting it. Some things to remember as we're putting it into our papers is that we have to keep the context and meaning to stay the same. Right? This is especially true, like I learned this in journalism, where I can take a quote, I can paraphrase that quote, I can start and stop that quote wherever I want to fit into my journalistic story, but I cannot change the meaning or the context of what someone says. And then also, to help that, make sure that you're not cutting down a quote too much so that a person could read it and misunderstand it, right? So you really have to focus in on key words and key phrases as you're embedding evidence. And this will be something that we practice of, like, where do we start, where do we stop a quotation, or when is it appropriate to paraphrase or summarize? So let's take a look at maybe how we select some of this evidence. So if I have this evaluative thesis, this good arguable thesis statement, that is George Bush's purpose in his 9/11 address to the nation is to dismiss the effects of terrorism and to reaffirm our strength as a nation to the world. Basically, as I am trying to defend this thesis or this claim, I'm looking for quotes in his speech that are really making me believe, okay, here's what he's talking about. Here's why he's talking about effects of terrorism, reaffirming our strength as a nation. And I've got some examples here. I'm going to let you read them. I don't have to read them to you, but you can kind of see how I've made this little chart in my mind of, okay, which quotes dismiss the effects of terrorism, which quotes reaffirm our strength as a nation, and even better, which quotes do both, because that really starts to get at my point of my thesis. If I'm trying to evaluate his purpose, and I can have a quote that does both, man, that's stellar. Even if I don't end up talking about both of his purposes when I'm explaining and examining that quote, the fact that it's even still there, readers are going to start to pick up on. And if you can point that out 1, 2, or 3 times, they're going to be like, oh yeah, that was his purpose of the 9/11 address. So as you're selecting evidence, always go back to your thesis. Does this thesis or does this piece of evidence actually go back to help my my purpose, my main claim, or is it just kind of out there, right? Okay, and so after we've found some evidence, we've embedded it, we have signal phrased it, we've got it all in there, we're ready to move on. But our next step is we always have to sort of explain and connect that evidence. Don't assume that the reader is making the same logical jumps that you are, where here's my claim, here's my evidence, and here's my explanation of that evidence as to why it's important and how it connects to my claim of this paragraph, or even how it connects to my bigger overall thesis, to my argument. So my kind of rule of thumb is, for however long the quote is, I try to have about twice as much explanation, analyzing that claim, breaking it down, and connecting it back to my thesis. So if it's a 2-line quote, I try to have 4 lines that are analysis and connection. And some things that might help you after you put in a quote is maybe use some of these sentence frames if you don't quite know where to get started. Like, okay, here's a quote or a paraphrase, and then knowing this will do what? And you'll notice that some of these are contradictory. So at first glance, like this quote might say this, but on a closer look, here's what it's actually doing, right? We can start using these pieces of evidence in our commentary as transition pieces once we start getting good at using them in our writing, just to make it more in-depth and more nuanced of an argument. So just some quick review of our basic argument structure. This is the way that I have finally understood this concept after 15 years of writing practice. Is I've had so many English teachers and so many wonderful college professors, and they're all stellar, but I've heard this same idea probably 5 or 6 different times explained in different ways, but the concepts are the same. People may juggle the vocabulary that they're using, but basically what it boils down to is we got to have a claim. What am I trying to prove? How am I going to prove that? And then how am I going to connect that? And I've heard that explained as like your claim is your topic sentence of your paragraph, or it's the main idea of your paragraph or of your paper, right? And then your evidence is your support or your quotes. And then you have to explain that piece of evidence, or you have to develop that piece of evidence or comment on that piece of evidence to show how it connects back to your claim. I don't care what vocabulary you use, but you need to understand, okay, here's a claim. Here's what I'm trying to prove. Here's some support. Here's why I'm kind of believing it. And here's how I'm going to connect my evidence back up to my claim. And this gets even bigger when we start thinking outside of just single paragraphs, right? So we have maybe our overarching thesis of an entire argument. And then for each offshoot idea, kind of each offshoot paragraph, if you want to think about it. But again, it's not necessarily just paragraphs. It could be sections of a work. Each one of those ideas has to have evidence, and each one of those pieces of evidence has to have some reasoning. And it all is connecting back to the big idea of that paragraph or that section. And then even further, that has to be clearly connected back to the thesis. So there's a line that can be easily drawn to any piece of evidence and reasoning in your paper, back to your main point or back to the main point of that section. So keep that in mind. It's a big kind of schematic that we have to follow. All right. One of our last pieces is once we have our evidence in there, once we've thought about it, okay, we think it all connects. Here's a self-check. 1, did I select evidence efficiently? Am I picking evidence that's actually working? Did I embed it effectively? Is the language that I used for this direct quote working, or do I need to paraphrase it? Or if I used a paraphrase or a summary, does it need to be more specific? Check, does this evidence actually go back to support my claim? And then do I explain that clearly after I give my piece of evidence? And so this gets to be really kind of tough. And this is what we're practicing, is how do you decide what evidence to use, how to present that evidence, what transition to use, what signal phrases to use, how to connect all these ideas. Like there's a lot to think about just in terms of evidence. And really, it kind of depends on these couple of things. Like, okay, what's my task? What am I trying to answer and respond to? Why am I even writing this paper, this argument? What's my thesis? Who am I writing this for? What's the context in which I'm writing this? And your style. You as an author get to have a say in how this is created too, right? That's part of being a rhetorician. That's part of being in this class, is you have to develop your own ideas on writing. And if you're saying like, hey, wait a second, Mr. Rested, those sound familiar, you're right. These are the 6 elements of a rhetorical situation: writer, context, audience, message, purpose, and exigence. They're all there every time you sit down to write a paper. And so considering your own rhetorical situation will help inform how and what evidence you do decide to use. All right. Good luck, folks.